What's up, y'all? Welcome back, man. LFR family, y'all are amazing. Now we are checking out something from Royalty Now Studios. Shout out to them. Please make sure that you hit the subscribe button just like I am doing right now and go check them out. They provided a video called Abraham Lincoln Brought to Life in Motion and Color with History. And this is important that I check this out because I've heard so many things about Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of people hold him extremely high. And I do know of a couple of things he's done. And a lot of people like to go directly to he freed the slaves. He freed the slaves. Well, guess what? All I got to say is, what about 1619? Huh? What about 1619? All right, so forget that. So we're about to go ahead and check this out. Y'all let me know what y'all think in the comments. Let's get to it. Where my dad?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we recreate famous figures from the past and talk about their history. Today, we're talking about the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. One of the most important men in modern history. We'll talk about his life, his struggles with mental health, and the war that would lead him to the decision that would change millions of lives forever. At the end, Becca will talk about what he looked like and reveal her recreations. So let's go ahead and get started. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky on February 12, 1809, to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. Thomas, who would later be described by Abraham Lincoln as a drifter, was a stern and demanding man who had led a harsh life. He couldn't read or write and believed anything but an honest trade was an enormous waste of time. Nancy was very different. She was mild yet strong, described by Lincoln's neighbors as superior to Thomas. She taught Lincoln his ABCs at a young age and is credited for giving Lincoln the sweetness and patience he would later be known for.
Shout out to moms.
They would move to Indiana when Abraham was 7 years old. Thomas was adamant that Abraham do most of the manual work needed to clear the land. Abraham would later state that his childhood on the farm was like being in a constant fight with trees, logs, and grubs. When a school opened up nearby, Nancy was able to convince Thomas to let Abraham and his sister Sarah attend. Lincoln realized pretty quickly that he loved to read and he hated working on the farm. Unfortunately for Abraham, circumstances would keep him out of school for most of his young life. When Abraham was 9 years old, his mother Nancy would die unexpectedly of milk sickness. This would mark the first of many tragedies in Lincoln's life, and later descriptions of Lincoln being melancholy all begin here with the death of his mother.
That breaks my heart, man. Every single time I hear about someone losing their parent at such a young age, and the women, oh man, oh wow. I didn't know this about him. Okay, this gives me a different perspective for sure. Okay, let's go.
Lincoln's father became quickly overwhelmed with keeping up the farm and caring for his children. Not long after the death of his wife, Thomas left them. For at least 6 months, Abe and Sarah survived off barely anything but dried berries Nancy had stored before her death. When Thomas finally returned in December of 1819, he was accompanied by his new wife, Sally Bush. When Abraham saw them, he ran towards them crying, right past his father, to the woman he had never met before. Sally Bush would treat Abraham as her own and begin to heal the wound that his mother's death had left him.
Wow.
She's credited for giving Abe his famous sense of humor and always made sure to find different books for Abraham to read after he had finished his chores. Abraham would later say that his stepmother had been his best friend in this world and that no son could love a mother more than he loved her.
That's what's up.
Lincoln would forever refer to Sally as Mama. By the time Lincoln turned 18, he had already grown to his famous height, 6'4" and impressively lanky.
Yeesh.
His teenage years had been spent mostly working for his father, and although he had barely attended school, he was always reading. Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, The Life of Washington, newspapers, songbooks, spelling books, the Bible, Lincoln began to tell stories and sermons.
Yo, I just want to say that the way that this gentleman did this video is blowing my mind. Thank you so much for doing this, because this right here really ties it in. Like when we see actual pictures of what he might have looked like, you know what I mean, and how he's growing from a boy to a young man to an older man, and why he became such a scholar the way that he is from all of the reading. This is wild, man. Thank you so much for putting it down like this. I mean, look at this right here. This is dope right here. I mean, maybe it's just me, but this is amazing.
To anyone that would listen. But it was around this time that the second tragedy of his life struck. Just before his 19th birthday, Sarah, his older sister, his caretaker during those long 6 months alone, died in childbirth.
Oh, man.
Lincoln spoke very little about his sister during his life, but according to Dennis Hanks, Lincoln's cousin and good friend, the loss of his sister was devastating. She had been his only connection to his mother, and now they were both gone.
Wow.
In an attempt to distract himself, he would go down to Louisiana with his best friend Alan. But when they arrived, they were met with a slave presence they had never seen before. It was here that Lincoln saw his first slave auction. The evil that his parents had been so adamantly against was right in front of his eyes for the first time. A husband and a wife, a mother and her child.
Hold up. So Lincoln's family was against slavery? What? Oh, man, this is getting better and better. Or as Reverend Jordan used to say, this is getting gooder and gooder.
Sold separately, never to see each other again. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
When Lincoln returned home, he decided it was time for him to strike out on his own. At the age of 22, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began his new life. During his first year, he'd find work at a general store and join the local debate club. It was here that people first noticed Abe's incredible talent at public speaking. Not long after, Abraham met a woman named Anne Rutledge. They'd become close friends and then fell in love. They agreed that they would get married, but only after Anne finished her studies. Soon enough, the people of New Salem, impressed with Abe's intelligence and wit, began to encourage Abe to get into politics. In 1832, he would run for state office for the first time. And although he lost, 277 out of the 300 votes cast in New Salem were for Lincoln.
Wow.
In 1834, Abraham would try again, only this time, he won. He was officially an Illinois state congressman. He was studying to become a lawyer, and in no time Anne would be finished with school, and they would finally be able to get married. But tragedy seemed to follow Lincoln everywhere he went. In 1835, Anne Rutledge, finished with her schooling, finally returned to New Salem. But not long after her arrival, a wave of typhoid hit the town. On August 25, 1835, Anne died at the age of 22.
I'm trying to be happy. Come on, man. Come on. I'm hearing all this great stuff about the brother. He's about to move into it, like his career is starting to take off. His lady finally finished schooling and they're ready to get married and do some things, start their own family. And someone else close to him, another woman close to him, passes away prematurely. Come on, man. What in the world, man? This is crazy.
I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forbade I shall not. But to remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me.
Wow.
Abraham decided he would get better. It may have simply been time, or maybe it was just Lincoln completely diving into his work. But in 1836, Abraham was able to pass the Illinois bar, completing his goal of becoming a lawyer, and he also won re-election. By 1843, he had become a leader of the newly formed Whig Party and decided that it might be time to finally settle down. After a long courtship, Lincoln would marry a woman named Mary Todd. Within a year, they would have a baby boy, and Lincoln would open up his own law practice. After the failed presidential campaign of his political idol, Henry Clay, and the following annexation of Texas as a slave state, Lincoln realized that the country was at a pivotal moment. The balance of slave states to free states was even, and the next few years would decide which direction the country went. He would begin to speak publicly against slavery, passionately speaking on the House floor. And although he wasn't calling for slavery's full abolishment in the United States just yet, he co-wrote a bill to abolish slavery outright in Washington, D.C.
You know, some people actually have an issue with him not calling it outright in the beginning, which is, I call it ass. I think that's ass that people will put that on someone. They're trying to make a change. They're trying to make a difference, but they realize how much goes into this. So it took a little bit more than that. He's trying to gain the trust of many of his constituents, all of the people that he worked with and are running against. He knows what he was doing. He was taking his time. Well, not really taking his time because he was attacking issues right then and there. But he knew how to attack those issues and how much pressure to add when he added the pressure.
Unfortunately for Lincoln, these radical views would backfire. He would lose support from his voters, and soon his party had divided itself over the issue of slavery. After the Whig Party won the 1848 presidential election, it was clear that Lincoln was being edged out. At the age of 40, Lincoln found himself without a party and realized that his political career was most likely over. Over the next 5 years, the debate over slavery became more and more hostile. Years of compromise between the North and South only delayed the issue. Lincoln had spent these years mostly focusing on his law practice, and more recently was mourning the loss of his second son.
Come on.
But in 1854, a man named Stephen A.
Nah, time out, bruh. He lost his daggone son? Come on, man. Come on, bruh. Imagine y'all was there at that during this time, and you had to debate either for or against slavery. I can imagine it wasn't as white and black as we would like to believe. A lot of people probably would be like, yeah, it is black and white because it was the blacks that was enslaved and it was the whites that was enslaving them. And it was easy to make a decision. Well, clearly not. Everybody's lives were tied into slavery in some way, shape, or form during this time. So you're freeing some people at the same time. You're making matters more difficult for everybody who set up this effed up situation in the first place. So now you're taking food away from them and their families at the same time, messing up the way that they run their economy. And yes, you're like, but slavery is wrong as hell. We need to do something about this right now. Now, you already saw what happened to him. He was extremely well respected, but as soon as he started to get vocal about it, really, he started to become more and more vocal about it, he got ostracized. So you can imagine how difficult this was for him.
Douglas proposed a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The act would allow those states to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be free or own slaves. The idea was that letting the people handle the issue themselves would take it out of political hands, but this could not have been further from what happened. It would instead lead to what is now called Bleeding Kansas. Anti- and pro-slavery settlers began a state-level civil war over Kansas.
Wow.
Election fraud, assault, and the political killing of more than 100 men would raise tensions over the issue of slavery to a boiling point. After years away from political life, Lincoln's outrage at the idea of letting the Union fall to the will of slave-owning states is what finally brought him out of hiding. In one of his first speeches back, Lincoln would calmly vent that outrage. Nearly 80 years ago, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration, that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. These principles cannot stand together, and whoever holds to one must despise the other. In 1858, Lincoln would run as a Republican for the U.S. Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, the very man who had brought him back into politics. Over the course of 7 debates that author Alan C. Guelzo calls the debates that defined America, Douglas and Lincoln would speak on slavery, morality, the Constitution, and what they would do to solve the problem that Lincoln thought was destroying the nation. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other. Citizens for—
Hold on, before we move forward, I just want to say Royalty Now. I don't know your name, but you did a hell of a job with this. Wow. Wow, man. I don't honestly, clearly I don't even know what to say. You did a remarkable job, because someone who is just being introduced to politics, myself and other people who are watching this video right here, means a great deal that you took this much time to do this right here. Thank you so much.
From all over the Midwest would travel by train to see the debates. Anyone who missed it in person was able to read the transcript the next day. Lincoln and Douglas knew they were speaking to the whole nation. When the votes came in on Election Day, Lincoln had won the popular vote by over 24,000 ballots,
Wow.
but he lost in the Electoral College, giving Douglas the seat in the Senate.
There you go.
Lincoln would take the loss bitterly, but the widespread media coverage of the event and Lincoln's stellar performance propelled him into the national spotlight. It wasn't long before rumors began to swirl of his potential nomination for president. Lincoln would begin campaigning around the nation. People who had never seen him in person before would catch their first glimpse and be caught totally by surprise. In an ill-fitted suit with disheveled hair and bags under his eyes, Lincoln would time and time again deliver perfectly reasoned, intelligent, and witty speeches to the amazement of the crowd. For the first 10 minutes, I couldn't believe the way he looked, the way he sounded, his accent. But after those 10 minutes, the flash of his eyes, the ease of his presentation overcame all doubts, and I was enraptured. His speeches would begin to spread in newspapers and pamphlets all over the North, and within months, he was the front runner for the presidency.
Wow.
He would go on to win the 1860 presidential election, a little over a month later. Before he was even sworn in, South Carolina would secede from the nation. In an attempt by Congress to stop the secession crisis, the Crittenden Compromise was conceived. The proposal included 6 constitutional amendments that would make slavery a permanent part of the Constitution. If these had passed, there would forever be a constitutional right to be a slave owner. Lincoln said he would rather suffer death than agree to the outrageous proposal. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th,
Before I continue this, and we only got a little bit more to go. No, we got about 10 minutes to go. Listen, before I continue this, I just wanted to say, because of all of this stuff going, that played an intricate part of the Constitution, this is why a great majority of urban city Black people, urban community Blacks, do not like the Constitution, because they believe, just from bits and pieces here and there, they know that there were a great deal of people during that time that did not want slavery to end. And there are still some older people alive to this day who were children back then, who were helping to raise their slave masters' children. And they are telling stories. And those stories of sharecropping and Jim Crow are much louder than all of the ways that we have gotten better as a nation. Okay? Just want you to hear that. Those stories are much louder. So when it comes to the Constitution, it's very difficult for a great majority of urban community Black people specifically, and probably down in the South too. I don't know too much about the South. But because I'm from the city, have a huge issue with the Constitution because of that. You can hear it a lot in the churches. Oh my God.
1861, 6 more southern states had joined South Carolina by leaving the Union. When Confederate shots were fired at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the American Civil War began. Faced with the daunting task of preserving the Union, Lincoln's famous compassion would turn to calculated coldness. He would immediately arrest thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers, ignoring a Supreme Court justice's order to let them go. He suppressed free media, declared martial law, and greatly expanded presidential war powers. His aggressive attitude rallied Northern men in droves. Within days, 75,000 men had volunteered to preserve the Union. Unfortunately for Lincoln, the North would suffer major losses in the first year of the war, mostly due to the pretentiousness and cowardice of one of his generals, George McClellan, but also because the Confederacy had taken Lincoln's best soldier. Robert E. Lee had been Lincoln's first choice to lead the Union Army, but when his home state of Virginia seceded from the nation, he declined and joined the Southern Army instead. It was now one of the better reasons Lincoln couldn't sleep at night.
Wow.
On most nights of the war, Lincoln could be found obsessively waiting for telegraph updates. He knew the casualties of every battle, what had happened, what had gone wrong. And he knew that morale in the North was beginning to fade. Even England was showing signs of support for the Confederacy. Any involvement or recognition by another global power would surely end any remaining support for the war. Abraham's dream of preserving the Union was fading quickly.
Now, some people told us, well, I've heard before that some people who was fighting for the Confederacy were not fighting to keep slavery alive and well. Some of the people who were fighting for the Confederacy were fighting as farm owners and just business owners and families who knew what was about to happen to their families with the way that the world was changing. Feel free to correct me, give me whatever information y'all want to give me, because y'all know, man, most of this stuff I just learned through you all by doing reactions, man. Because politics never turned me on, man. And then when I checked it out, it was so negative. Nobody wanted to give me the real information. They just wanted to give, like MSNBC and CNN was just giving me information, enough information to hate Fox. That's it. And anything that Fox liked, MSNBC and CNN will give us whatever information we possibly wanted to make us dislike them. So it was always a battle when it came to that.
At the worst imaginable time, Willie, Lincoln's 11-year-old boy, died of typhoid fever.
Oh, come on, man.
Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, would have a mental breakdown, and Abraham was inconsolable. But if Lincoln's life of tragedy had taught him anything, it was that even in the darkest of times he could find a way to move forward. Everything that had happened to him in his life had led him to this, and he would not fail the millions of lives that now depended on him. In order for Europe to stay out of the conflict, Abraham would have to make them realize what this American struggle was truly about. On September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. But the executive order would mean nothing unless the North won the war. The proclamation would also allow for African Americans, the very group that had the most to fight for, to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 African American soldiers would answer the call and take their fate into their own hands.
Wow.
Union soldiers everywhere now felt more strongly that this was a battle for good versus evil, a mission from God to liberate millions from the evil of slavery.
Wow.
In the summer of 1863, the Confederate Army met the Union Army at a small town 80 miles outside of D.C. called Gettysburg. Over the next 3 days, 50,000 men would lose their lives in what is still the deadliest day in U.S. history. In a short speech dedicated to the men who lost their lives that day, Lincoln would begin with his now famous words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Robert E. Lee would formally surrender to the Union on April 9, 1865, and the Civil War would come to an end after the deaths of nearly 1 million Americans.
Ooh, sheesh.
Lincoln.
And that was the Gettysburg Address, right? If it wasn't, listen, I don't mind being wrong. I'm learning here. So if it was, it was. If it wasn't, it wasn't. But this is good information to have right now.
Who had aged decades during the course of the war, was finally free from the misery and unimaginable pressure of the last 4 years. A few days later, on April 14th, Lincoln was said to have been the happiest his wife had ever seen him. Mary and Lincoln would take a carriage ride through Washington, where he was seen smiling and waving. "We must both be more cheerful in the future," he would say to his wife. That night, they would attend a comedy together at Ford Theater. During one of its many roars of laughter, a shot suddenly rang out. John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, shot Abraham Lincoln directly in the back of the head. By the time they reached a doctor, there was nothing that could be done. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Just before his death, Lincoln made sure that the fight for the Union, the deaths of so many men, and his Emancipation Proclamation would not be in vain. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and indentured servitude in the United States of America. The freedom of millions of men, women, and children from the cruelty and hellish reality of slavery had finally arrived. Lincoln is one of the most celebrated men in modern history. Every tragedy, every failure, every struggle he went through taught him the compassion and fortitude he would need to eventually lead his nation out of its darkest time. The great emancipator has become a moral compass for the American people, and to me, is a symbol of what a truly great man is.
So, what did Abraham Lincoln really look like? This is our first time covering a subject who has been photographed, but Lincoln's life is just too fascinating for us to ignore. My goal with this section will be to talk about how Lincoln's contemporaries described him, and then of course reveal some recreations and animations that look more photorealistic to really bring him back to life. Lincoln seemed an incredibly hard man to truly capture. Lincoln's secretary, John Nicolay, writes, "Lincoln's features were the despair of every artist who undertook his portrait. They put into their pictures the large, rugged features and strong, prominent lines. They made measurements to obtain exact proportions, but the picture remained hard and cold. The picture was to the man as the grain of sand to the mountain, as the dead to the living. There are many pictures of Lincoln. There is no portrait of him." Author Walt Whitman agreed, saying, "None caught the deep though subtle and indirect expression of this man's face. There is something else there. A painter from another time or generation is needed." Quotes about Lincoln's appearance all agree. He was a tall, thin man, slightly awkward, with an intellectual face. He also was described as having a sadness about him, which is no surprise given the many tragedies that he suffered.
So many.
It seems he still managed to be very kind, and his eyes were much softer and more emotional than the rest of his face. Unique in appearance, Lincoln was also unique in voice and mannerisms. He had a very distinct voice and speaking style, so much that nearly everyone that listened to him remarked upon it somehow. Journalist Horace White described Lincoln as having a thin tenor, or rather falsetto voice, almost as high-pitched as a whistle. The New York Herald reported that his voice had a frequent tendency to dwindle into a shrill and unpleasant sound. Lincoln was said to have spoken slowly, pausing between words and phrases, letting his words really sink in. And despite the shrillness of his voice, his words still resonate with us even today. So let's take a look at some recreations and motion of Abraham Lincoln now.
That's good enough for this part right here. I will be putting the original link down below so you can go check that out if you haven't already. But I really enjoyed that, guys. Now it's your turn. Please let me know whatever you want me to know in the comments below. And if you have yet to hit that subscribe button, please make sure you do so on your way out the door. Once again, guys, I am Van, and now we are all the LFR family, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Hopefully inside the Patreon as well. Y'all have been amazing, man, per usual. Love y'all.